Hello, welcome to my channel. I am starting this video right after finishing another video, so I just want to get right into it. The Women's Prize shortlist was announced a few days ago as I'm filming this, and I was right about 2 of the books. What was I right about? Was I right about anything? Fire Rush and Demon Copperhead. Yes, I was right about 2 of the books on the shortlist, so I feel like that's not great. But we're not focusing on that. This video, we are focusing on reading all of the shortlist, ranking them, and then saying which one I think is going to win the prize. So I have already read 2.5 of the books. So I actually have 2 reading vlogs for the Women's Prize already. In the first one, I read Demon Copperhead as well as Homesick. So I'll talk about that again and like kind of sum up my feelings on it at the end of this video when I do the rankings, but I have already read that one. And then in the second reading vlog, I read half of Pod, and I wasn't really getting along with it, so I decided to DNF it until I found out whether it was on the shortlist or not. So I will be picking that back up and finishing it. But also Trespasses I read and talked about in that video. So that's another one. I'll talk about it again when I get to the rankings portion of this video. But if you want to know my more in-depth thoughts about it, then definitely go back and watch that other reading vlog. So that means I have, what, 3.5 books to read. So I have Fire Rush, which I'm so excited that it was shortlisted purely just because I really wanted to read it. Black Butterflies, The Marriage Portrait, which I have here from the library, and Pod, of course, which I did have from the library, but I had to return it because my loan time was up. So I'll have to get that again. Or I think they have the ebook too. So we'll see, whatever comes first. So I think I'm just gonna start with The Marriage Portrait and get the big one out of the way, but maybe Fire Rush. I haven't quite decided yet. So, quick reading update. Right now I am out doing some errands and I finished listening to Fire Rush, so I figured I'd just talk about it real quick from this Publix parking lot before I'm dreading going into the grocery store. It is like the worst time to be in there, like middle of the day on Saturday. Maybe middle of the day Sunday's worse. I don't know. All I know is it's gonna be packed and I don't want to do it. But first, I want to talk about Fire Rush. Also, I think that if I don't talk about it right away, that I'll like lose bits of it or lose thoughts. The book itself is real, like the writing is really, really good, and I can tell that. However, for me, it's too descriptive, or there's like too many describing words that are in it. It's definitely told in a very like rhythmic and prose almost way. I don't know, I'm very bad at prose in general, and talking about it and reading it and everything that goes along with it. I'm trying to get better, but I do really struggle with it. So I did struggle with this book. But I will say that the feelings that it evokes, I think, are pretty spot on to what it was going for. So this is centered around, oh my god, what is the main character's name? I can always remember everybody else's name, but never the protagonist, the person whose perspective we're in. But she's a DJ, and then she's got her friends and her like boyfriend that she kind of like starts seeing at the beginning of the book, Moose. And you're kind of just following her in her life, but it's very impacted by everything else going on around. Like, she can't just live her normal life because of the time period she's living in and because she's black. And she has to be super aware of police presence and police in plain clothes. You get a sense for her life and for feeling always unsettled and not safe, particularly around police officers. And then having this like safe haven that is the Crypt, which is this underground club that she goes to. And during those like club scenes, the book does such a good job, like the writing and the language is such a good job of making you feel like you only know what's going on like right here, and that everything else is kind of like chaos, that there are other things happening right outside your little bubble, but all you know is this little bubble. And I feel like that's very accurate to how it actually feels like going out on a night dancing and like only knowing like what's going on right here. And I think that the book did a great job of showing all of that. But overall, I did really struggle with reading it. I just had a hard time with the language in general. And yeah, so it's one of those things where I can like really respect it because I can tell that it's so well written, but I personally struggled. Anyways, I think I'm gonna actually do Pod next instead of The Marriage Portrait, which is what I was originally thinking, because Pod just came in the mail and I just want to rip that band-aid off and get through that book. I read a little bit of it this morning just because I had time to like sit and read, and I only had the audiobook for Fire Rush, and it's already super difficult again. So I'm not looking forward to continuing in on it. On the scenes that I just read were like infuriating. I
I don't even know how I'm gonna talk about it later. I barely want to talk about it now, and I certainly don't want to read it now, but I have about 100 pages left, so hopefully we'll get there soon. Okay, I'll stop putting off going to the grocery store now.
I've done it. I finished Pod. Thank you, thank you. But before I talk about this, there was one thing that I forgot to say about Fire Rush. I forgot to say that the Fire Rush audiobook was incredible. If you are thinking of reading that book, I highly recommend going with the audiobook because there's music that goes along with it. There's like a lot of song portions and the narrator actually sings those parts, or there's just music in general that's used throughout, and I think it adds a lot to the book. So if you're a fan of audiobooks already and you're thinking about reading the book, then I definitely recommend going the audiobook route. Anyways, let's talk about Pod. So I had read about a third of this book prior to like this video for my last video reading women's prize books, and oddly my feelings have only gotten more complex about it. If you watched that video, you might remember that I was enjoying this book initially, and then I started getting really bored, and then I like just wasn't really caring at all about like the characters, and then I stopped. And when I picked it back up just for this video, the next section that I read, like the whole middle section of the book, I hated. In fact, when I filmed my last clip where I had finished Fire Rush, but I had gotten back started with this, I don't know if you can tell how angry I was that I had to be reading this book, but I was angry. Like, I don't know many books that made me as mad as this did. And it was just, I hated reading what was there. I recommend looking up the trigger warnings if you're interested in reading this book, because I had no idea, which is fine. I never look up trigger warnings for books. It's not something that I typically worry about, but the extent that they go into and how long it lasts, it just keeps like coming back. Like you think it's over, but it's not. It was tough to read. And already like there were little aspects of this book that made me really annoyed, or that I just didn't like reading, or just made me not feel great while reading it, which I won't explain that scene. But another thing that kind of contributed to it was, it's called a remora, and it's this like fish that it's kind of like parasitic, where it clings to another fish or another creature. So one has clinged onto E, who's the main character dolphin of this book, and it's the thoughts that it has, and like it's able to communicate with her. And I really hated that fish as a character, but also the things that it would say to her, and it just felt like this constant nagging presence that was really frustrating to have be around, and felt really repetitive, which was what had already gotten me more bored. And then it led into me getting like mad, and then that fish throughout this scene was like when I was just I was on another level. However, the end of the book was a lot better. The last third of the book was a lot faster paced. I felt like there was kind of something to hope for, or I felt more empathetic towards some of the characters that I hadn't previously felt empathetic towards. So I thought that the ending was good. I think overall, mostly because of how mad I was at one, I don't think I never want to be that mad at something, you know, like it's not worth it to me. So I don't think that I would go around recommending this book to anybody. And I think that feeling that I got is going to stick with me a lot longer than any other thoughts I had about any other parts of the book. So while I am very glad that the ending, I enjoyed the ending, I liked it better and I liked reading it better than the rest of the book, I wouldn't really recommend this to people to read. I'm sorry. I know some people really liked this book, but I really don't want this one to win. It is a nice rainy day here, perfect for reading, and I have finished The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell, and like, I can't believe how much I liked this. I don't tend to pick up a lot of historical fiction. I usually try to stay away from it, especially this kind of era or this theme of like large houses, palaces, families that need to marry off their daughters and are doing so for power and all of that stuff. There's something about it that I don't personally like typically, although like Jane Austen, love Jane Austen. Just this is not typically something I would, like I knew that this blew up. It was so popular when it came out. And I was like, yeah, I'm not going to read that. It's just not my cup of tea. But now that I have read it, I'm so glad that I did. This follows Lucrezia, who is a young, at the start of well, actually, technically it starts with her birth, but mostly you get her at age like 13 to 15 years old. So she, I believe, was a real historical figure who was in all likelihood killed by her husband. I don't think he was ever like convicted for that, but that's the story. And so you follow her and through her childhood, but also you get glimpses of the like present time, which would be when she's with Alfonso, her husband, and she's realized that he's trying to kill her. I think that the story even starts with like that realization. Yeah, the last sentence of the first paragraph ends with, when it comes to her with a peculiar clarity, as if some colored glass has been put in front of her eyes, or perhaps removed from them, that he intends to kill her. Oh, and actually she's 16 at that point. So you have this sense of like doom, like this foreboding thing, this inevitability where you know that she's going to wind up in this spot where she is thinking, my husband's about to kill me, but you see her like growing up and kind of the hopefulness of certain situations, even the hopefulness of like meeting Alfonso to begin with. It's really weird to like jump back and forth between like the present day and the story leading up to it. But because of that, like it's just done so well. And honestly, like my favorite parts about it, I can't even talk about because I feel like they would be spoilers for the story as a whole. But I think Lucrezia is a great character to follow. There's other people around her that I enjoyed learning about. And of course, it does still say a lot about what it was like at that time period to just be kind of sold off, essentially, to be almost traded for some type of gain that the family could get out of having raised a daughter without any regard for what she wants. And she's like completely just alone in this, to like send her off to a different culture, a different world at 15 years old. Like that's the age she was when she leaves home, and like with next to no information. Like, ugh. But anyways, that is the marriage portrait. So now I am on to Black Butterflies. So I finished Black Butterflies and it was so good. I stayed up so late last night finishing this in bed. So late, in fact, that I just took an hour-long nap, which I don't typically take a lot of naps. But I was just so, like, I had to find out what the ending was going to be. And it was also just like emotionally really getting to me. And then it took me so long to fall asleep because I was just thinking about it, playing over a bunch of different portions of it in my mind. So this takes place in Sarajevo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right because I've just read it this whole time, but it's a town in Bosnia. At the very beginning, I kind of looked into some of the history, but then I was like, oh, actually, like, I don't think that I want to know, because I ended up finding out how long the city was under siege. And that did kind of impact me while I was reading it. And so I kind of wish that I hadn't. But it's definitely an aspect of history that I knew nothing about, like absolutely nothing about. But basically, it's a city under siege. There are a few different nationalities. There are Serbs, Muslims, and Croats. And then the entire city, like, you can't get out of it, basically. And it's being bombed, shelled, and they're cutting off like the phone lines and the water and power. The food supply is like dwindling, and our main character Zora is in the midst of this. So she lives there typically with her husband Franjo, I think it was, and her mom also lives with her for part of the year. But her mom is kind of struggling a bit more at like just being under a stressful situation in general, as they kind of like start seeing inklings towards what's about to happen, but very minimal. Like there's no way they could have predicted what all ends up happening. And so Franjo and her mother leave, and she stays so that she can make sure that they still have like their apartment, because there's this law in effect basically that says that refugees can take over any vacated apartments. So she stays to make sure that they like still own basically where they live, and at the end of their time away, then they can no longer get back, because that's when the city's fully under siege. And so she's kind of holding down the fort and still trying to do like a as much of her regular life as possible, but that gets harder and harder as things go further on. She ends up connecting more with her neighbors. There's a lot that ends up happening, but I don't want to get too far into it because I think it is really just such an experience to read through it. I will say that I did cry at one point, and also just like the entire ending, it was such like a mix of emotions I can't even describe, which I think is what led me to just staying up thinking about it over and over. So yeah, it was a really, really good book. So I'm gonna go ahead and rank the books from my least favorite to my favorite. So the 6th place book for me, I think, is going to have to be Pod. Although I liked the ending, overall, like, my feelings towards it are just pretty negative, and I can't really separate that. I've already talked about this one a lot in this video, so I won't extrapolate further, but for those reasons that I talked about, this is gonna be last place for me. And then in 5th place, I'm kind of torn between two. I think I'm gonna put Trespasses there, actually. I liked Trespasses, but it just was kind of a meh book for me overall. Like, it didn't really stick with me. I read it really quickly, so that's saying something. I think some people took a lot longer with it. I think maybe I was just reading it quickly because I didn't want to be reading Pod, and so every time I thought about like, oh, I should be reading Pod, then I just read that one instead. But yeah, I don't think that it was doing a whole lot. Like, I think it's a pretty well-written book, but past that, there's not really much substance there. And then in 4th, I'm gonna go ahead and put Fire Rush. And that's very personal because I do think that it's a good book. I just it didn't work for me personally, but that's just because I struggle with the style of writing that it has, and I know that for other books as well that are very much beloved. So that's a me thing. And then in 3rd, I'm gonna go with Demon Copperhead. I really enjoyed that book. I think it was Kieran that initially said that if you like The Goldfinch, that this is similar. And I really liked that comparison because I liked The Goldfinch for the same reasons that I liked Demon Copperhead. And that's kind of funny because last year I compared The Goldfinch to The Book of Form and Emptiness when I reviewed that one, and then that one ended up winning the Women's Prize. But yeah, I thought that was a good book, very well written. And then we get into the ones that I just like loved, which was The Marriage Portrait, which is going to be my 2nd place. I think especially because it's a genre, it's a topic that I don't normally enjoy reading about, but I just found that it did such a good job of like taking a different perspective or writing it in a different way, having those flash forwards to this like sense of impending doom where this woman, I don't even want to call her a woman, she's like a girl, is convinced that her husband's going to kill her. And seeing her in that state and then seeing her life up until that point, it did something very different that I hadn't seen before, but also did it in a really great way. Which makes my top book, of course, Black Butterflies. Oh, I didn't hold up The Marriage Portrait when I was talking about it, and I had it right here and everything. Oh well. But yeah, top book, my favorite of the list was Black Butterflies. I thought that this was just a fantastic book. The visuals in it were told so well, were described so well, but without being overly descriptive, which I think is sometimes a fine line to walk, but I could just envision everything that was happening here. I really felt like I was there. I know that that's a term that's used a lot around books, but there's very few times when I personally feel like using that phrase to describe how I felt in a book, and I felt it with this book. Also, I just like that it taught me about a period in history that I didn't know anything about, and I do think that that added to what I personally got out of it. But I also think that a lot of people are going to feel that way, and so that means that I think that this one's going to win the prize. Or at least I really, really hope. I could see The Marriage Portrait winning, but Hamnet just won like not that long ago. And this one was like so incredible. This one was next level for me. Anyways, that is going to do it for this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please do consider subscribing. And after this, I'm gonna be moving on to focusing on my TBR though, which is very exciting. So I'm gonna be doing 5 weeks of reading from my TBR, but each week will kind of be themed differently, and I'll be filming a video for each of those. So I think that the first one is going to be catching up on NetGalley things, because I have some things that are coming up on their archive date, and I really want to get to them before that happens to make sure my score doesn't absolutely plummet. So yeah, if you want to see me focusing on the books I already own, then definitely subscribe and keep an eye out for that video. And hopefully I will see you then. Bye.